The cruelest thing Adrian DeLuca ever taught me was how to disappear without leaving the room. The penthouse was silent when he came home that night. Not peaceful silent. Hollow silent. The kind that presses against your ears until you notice every tiny sound you used to ignore. The soft hum of the city 32 floors below. The ticking gold clock above the marble fireplace. The faint rain tapping against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. Slow. Confident. The footsteps of a man who owned half the city and expected the rest of it to kneel eventually. Adrian loosened his black tie as he walked through the dark living room. His expensive wool coat draped over one shoulder, phone still in his hand. He smelled like rain, whiskey, and those endless late-night meetings that always mattered more than coming home early. "Evelyn," he called without looking up from his screen. Calm. Casual. Like I would answer the way I always did. I didn't. For the first time in 6 years, there was no warm light waiting for him in the kitchen. No tea left on the counter. No soft voice asking if he had eaten yet. He finally looked up then. The candles were gone. The fresh flowers too. The piano bench near the window sat empty beneath a thin layer of dust because I had stopped playing months ago, and he had never noticed. His gaze landed on the dining table. That was when he froze. 2 sheets of paper rested beside my wedding ring. Divorce papers. Signed neatly in black ink. My handwriting looked strangely calm for something that had taken me many hours to finish because my hands would not stop shaking. Adrian stared at them for a long moment before letting out a quiet laugh beneath his breath. Not angry. Not hurt. Amused. Like I had done something childish. "Cute," he murmured to himself. I closed my eyes and faintly heard those words. Cute. 6 years of swallowing loneliness until it tasted like part of me, and somehow he still thought this was temporary. A performance. A wife trying to make a point. He picked up the paper slowly, scanning the first page while loosening the cuffs of his white dress shirt. Calm. Detached. Untouchable. The great Adrian DeLuca. Men feared him. Politicians respected him. Entire rooms changed when he walked into them. But he never learned how to read the woman sitting across from him at dinner every night. He reached the final page and finally noticed the empty space beside the staircase. My suitcase was gone. The realization hit him quietly. I could always tell the exact second something unsettled Adrian because his shoulders became perfectly still. No movement. No breathing. Nothing. Then his phone buzzed. One of his men. Another business problem. Another crisis somewhere downtown. Adrian declined the call without taking his eyes off the papers. He looked around the apartment again, slower this time, like he was seeing it properly for the first time. Seeing the missing books from the shelves. Seeing the cold fireplace. Seeing the abandoned piano. Seeing the life I had slowly erased piece by piece while standing right beside him. Then his eyes lifted toward the second floor where our bedroom waited in darkness. Empty. The silence stretched between us even though he didn't know I was still there watching from the shadows at the top of the stairs. And for the first time since I married Adrian Russo, I realized something terrifying. He had never once believed I would leave him. Adrian found me a few minutes later. I heard footsteps downstairs as I sat in the dark corner of the living room, gazing at the Manhattan skyline through the rain-streaked window. My suitcase stood beside the door untouched. I had packed it 3 hours ago. But leaving Adrian DeLuca had turned out to be harder than signing the papers. Not because I still believed he loved me the way I needed him to, but because after 6 years of becoming someone's shadow, even freedom felt unfamiliar. His footsteps moved through the penthouse slowly this time. Careful. Like he was walking through the ruins of something expensive. Then his voice echoed up the staircase. "Evelyn." Lower than before. Sharper. I closed my eyes. There had been a time when hearing my name in his voice made my heart race for entirely different reasons. Back when I was 24 and stupid enough to mistake protection for love. Back when Adrian still looked at me like I mattered more than his empire. I heard him stop outside the guest room door before pushing it open without knocking. Of course he did. Adrian had never knocked in his own home. The room fell silent when his eyes landed on the suitcase beside me. He leaned against the doorway in his black dress shirt with the divorce papers still folded in one hand. His dark hair was slightly damp from the rain outside, And under the soft amber lighting he looked exactly like the man every magazine in New York called untouchable. Calm. Controlled. Beautiful in the coldest possible way. "You are serious," he said finally. "Not emotional. Just surprised. Like discovering the ocean could disappear overnight." I looked down at my hands folded in my lap because if I looked directly at him for too long, I might lose the courage I had spent years trying to build. "I have never been more serious about anything." Adrian gave a quiet exhale through his nose that almost sounded like amusement. "This is because of tonight?" I laughed softly before I could stop myself. Not a happy laugh. The kind that comes from exhaustion. "You really think this started tonight?" His jaw tightened slightly. Tiny movement. Most people would not have noticed it. I did because studying Adrian's moods had become survival instinct years ago. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "you are overreacting." There it was. The same sentence he used every time I tried to explain loneliness to a man who had never spent a single day emotionally starving. I finally looked up at him then. "At dinner tonight," I said quietly, "when you told everyone you married me because I was obedient." Adrian's expression barely changed. "It was a joke." They laughed. Because it was funny. My chest tightened so painfully I had to look away again. That was the problem with Adrian. He never understood the damage because cruelty delivered calmly still sounded civilized coming from him. "Do you know what I realized while they were laughing?" I whispered. He stayed silent. I stood slowly, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my sweater just to keep my hands steady. "You do not know me at all." Adrian pushed himself off the doorway then, watching me with growing irritation mixed with something else he probably hated feeling. Uncertainty. "I know everything about you." Another soft laugh escaped me. "What is my favorite song?" Silence. "What book am I always rereading when I cannot sleep?" Nothing. His eyes darkened slightly. "Evelyn, what did I want before I became your wife?" That question finally landed. I saw it in the way his shoulders stiffened. Because Adrian DeLuca could memorize stock markets, political alliances, security routes, and every weakness of every enemy he had ever faced. But somewhere along the way, he stopped learning anything about the woman sleeping beside him every night. The rain hit the windows harder outside. I picked up my suitcase before speaking again. "You loved that I was quiet," I said softly. "You never stopped to ask why I became that way." Adrian looked at the suitcase in my hand like it offended him personally. Not because it was expensive leather sitting in the middle of his perfectly designed penthouse, but because it represented something he could not control. I watched his eyes move over me slowly, searching for hesitation the same way he studied enemies across negotiation tables. Adrian always believed every problem had a pressure point. Money, fear, loyalty, time. He just had to find mine. "Where are you planning to go?" he asked finally. Calm voice. Dangerous calm. I wrapped my fingers tighter around the suitcase handle. "Somewhere quiet." "You already live somewhere quiet." The irony almost made me smile. "Exactly." He took 2 slow steps into the room then, expensive dress shoes silent against the hardwood floor. "You are emotional right now," he said. "Tomorrow morning, this will seem tense and unnecessary." There was a time those words would have made me doubt myself instantly. Adrian had spent years sounding so certain about everything that eventually, I started believing my feelings were temporary inconveniences instead of warnings. But something inside me had gone numb months ago. And numbness, I learned, could become freedom if it lasted long enough. "Do you remember my 27th birthday?" I asked quietly. His expression flickered with confusion at the sudden question. "Of course." "What did we do?" Silence stretched between us. I could actually see him searching through memories like files in one of his office cabinets. Nothing came, because there was nothing to remember. He had missed my birthday dinner for a meeting in Chicago, then sent white roses to the penthouse at 11:30 that night with a handwritten card from his assistant. Adrian noticed my expression change and realized the answer too late. "I was working," he said carefully. "You always are." The room felt colder suddenly. Or maybe that was just what truth sounded like after years of avoiding it. Adrian rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw before looking at me again. "You knew what my life was when you married me." "I knew your life," I whispered. I just did not realize I would disappear inside it. Something in his face tightened then. Small. Brief. But real. Adrian hated emotional conversations because emotions could not be negotiated like contracts. They could not be silenced with expensive gifts or solved with security teams and private jets. I moved toward the dresser near the window and opened the top drawer one last time. Inside sat the remains of the woman I used to be. Sheet music covered in dust. A notebook filled with bookstore business plans I stopped writing 3 years ago. A tiny pair of knitted baby socks hidden beneath old letters. My breathing almost failed when I saw them again. Adrian noticed where my eyes landed. His expression changed immediately. Evelyn. I shut the drawer too fast. Too late. The silence between us turned heavy. Painful. 6 months ago, I had lost the baby at 10 weeks while Adrian was in Milan handling some emergency involving shipments and politicians and men in suits who mattered more than I did. I told him over the phone because his assistant said he could only spare 3 minutes. 3 minutes. That was how long my husband gave me to grieve our child with him before another call interrupted the conversation. Adrian took another step closer now, slower this time. Why are you bringing this up? He asked softly. I looked at him in disbelief. Because it destroyed me. His face finally lost some of its perfect control then. Not completely. Adrian DeLuca did not fall apart easily. But I saw it in his eyes. That terrible realization creeping in piece by piece. He had missed more than anniversaries and dinners. He had missed me breaking apart quietly right in front of him. I picked up my suitcase again before my courage disappeared. The worst part is not that you forgot pieces of me, I whispered. It is that I stayed long enough to start forgetting myself too. Adrian did not try to stop me when I walked toward the bedroom door. That frightened me more than if he had raised his voice. Silence from him usually meant calculation. I could feel his eyes following me down the hallway as the rain battered the windows harder outside, turning Manhattan into blurred gold and gray lights beneath the storm. My wedding ring still sat downstairs, cold against the marble table where I had left it. I wondered if Adrian had noticed that I did not take a single piece of jewelry with me. Not the diamonds. Not the watches. Not the black credit card with no spending limit. None of it had ever felt like mine anyway. I entered our bedroom slowly. The room looked untouched. Perfect. Like a luxury hotel suite waiting for guests who never truly lived there. The bed was still neatly made from that morning because I had stopped sleeping properly months ago and started waking up before sunrise just to avoid lying beside a man who felt emotionally miles away. I set my suitcase near the closet and stared at the long white dress hanging near the back. The charity gala from 3 weeks ago. I had not unpacked it yet. Adrian appeared quietly behind me a moment later, his reflection tall and dark in the bedroom mirror. You are really leaving over a dinner joke in a rough year? He asked. Rough year. I almost smiled at how easily men like Adrian reduced devastation into convenient language. A rough year sounded like traffic and headaches and delayed flights. Not panic attacks in empty bathrooms while staring at positive pregnancy tests that would never matter long enough to become nursery rooms. Do you remember the gala? I asked softly. He frowned slightly. Which one? That answer hurt more than I expected. There had been too many parties for him to remember the one that finally broke something inside me. The Russo Foundation event at the Grand Crescent Hotel, I said quietly. The night in March. Adrian stayed silent for a second before nodding once. Yes. Of course he remembered eventually. That gala had secured a business alliance worth millions. I remembered something else entirely. I remembered standing alone beneath crystal chandeliers wearing a silver gown so tight I could barely breathe while politicians and socialites smiled at me like I was another polished decoration beside the champagne towers. Adrian had spent most of the night discussing deals near the terrace with men twice his age. Every time I approached him, someone else pulled him away. Another handshake. Another conversation. Another urgent matter more important than his wife standing 10 feet away trying not to feel invisible. Then she arrived. Tall. Beautiful. Confident in the effortless way wealthy women often were around powerful men. I never learned her name. I only remembered the way she laughed while adjusting Adrian's tie with familiar fingers as though touching him belonged naturally to her. He did not stop her. That was the part one could never forget. Not because I believed he was unfaithful. Adrian was many things, but betrayal was not his style. No. What destroyed me was simpler than that. He looked more alive talking to a stranger for 5 minutes than he had looked with me in years. I waited for you that night, I whispered. For 4 hours. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly again. I told you the event ran late. No, I said softly. You forgot I was there. The room fell silent except for the rain outside and the distant sound of sirens far below the penthouse windows. Adrian looked away first. Tiny movement. Tiny crack. But I saw it. Evelyn, he said after a long pause, you know how my world works. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I forced them back because crying in front of Adrian always made me feel young and powerless and easy to dismiss. That is the problem, I whispered. For 6 years your world kept growing larger. I looked directly at him then. And mine became smaller every day. I loved you. Adrian stared at me for so long that the room began to feel too small for breathing. Outside, thunder rolled across Manhattan like distant warning signs. But inside the penthouse everything remained painfully still. That was always the dangerous thing about Adrian Russo. He did not explode when he was upset. He became quieter, colder, more controlled. So what happens now? He asked finally. His voice was calm enough to unsettle me. I swallowed hard before answering. I leave. No, the word came immediately. Firm. Certain. Like the conversation had already ended in his mind. I looked down at the suitcase handle in my hand just to avoid the weight of his eyes. You do not get to decide that for me anymore. Adrian stepped closer then, slow and deliberate, until the scent of rain and cedar surrounded me again. For 1 week second my heart betrayed me with memory. Midnight drives through the city. His hand resting against the small of my back during crowded events. The way he used to look at me before power became the center of his universe. But memories were dangerous things. They made lonely women stay too long. You are upset, he said quietly. I understand that. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. No, Adrian. You understand inconvenience. You do not understand me. His jaw tightened again. You are my wife. I was your wife. The correction landed harder than I expected. I saw it in his eyes immediately. Adrian looked at me like he had just realized something valuable was slipping through his fingers, and he did not know how to stop it without crushing it completely. You signed papers, he said carefully. That does not erase 6 years. Tears burned behind my eyes again, but exhaustion kept them there instead of letting them fall. 6 years of what? I whispered. Waiting for you to notice I was unhappy? Adrian dragged one hand through his dark hair in visible frustration now. Tiny cracks were beginning to split through his perfect control. I gave you everything. Exactly. I looked around the bedroom slowly. The massive windows. The designer furniture. The diamonds sitting untouched on the vanity. Everything except yourself. Silence. Heavy and suffocating. Then Adrian did something unexpected. He reached for my suitcase. Not aggressively. Not cruelly. Just calmly taking hold of the handle before I could move toward the door. You are not leaving tonight. My heartbeat stumbled painfully. Move. No, Adrian. It is 2 in the morning and there is a storm outside. His voice lowered further. You can leave tomorrow if you still want to. I stared at him in disbelief because there it was again. That instinct to control situations until they bent in his favor. Adrian always believed time worked for him. That emotions faded overnight. That women forgave eventually if given enough comfort and silence. But something inside me had finally broken beyond repair. You still think this is temporary? I said softly. He did not answer. Which was answer enough. I stepped closer to him then until only inches separated us. Adrian looked down at me carefully, guarded now, like he no longer trusted where this conversation might go. Do you know what the saddest part is? I whispered. I used to beg for crumbs from you. His expression flickered slightly. Evelyn. One dinner together. One vacation without your phone. One conversation where you looked at me like I mattered more than business for 5 minutes. My voice trembled despite my effort to stay calm. And I convinced myself that wanting love from my own husband made me needy. Adrian's face changed then. Subtle. But real. Regret perhaps. or guilt finally beginning to breathe inside him for the first time in years. I reached down slowly, removed his hand from the suitcase handle, and held it there for one brief second. Warm, familiar, dangerous to my resolve. You taught me how to survive loneliness, I whispered. Now you are going to learn what it feels like. Adrian did not sleep that night. I knew because neither did I. The penthouse remained wrapped in silence while the storm slowly faded outside, leaving only the distant glow of Manhattan beneath gray dawn clouds. Around 4 in the morning I heard him downstairs moving through the kitchen alone, cabinet doors opening softly, glass against marble. The strange part was not the noise. It was that Adrian DeLuca almost never entered the kitchen himself. Someone else always prepared things for him. Coffee appeared before he asked for it. Dinner waited when he came home. His life had been arranged so perfectly that he stopped noticing the invisible hands keeping it running years ago, including mine. I sat curled against the guest room window watching the city wake up beneath pale morning light while exhaustion pressed behind my eyes like bruises. My suitcase still stood beside the bed untouched. Part of me hated that I had not walked out already. Another part knew I needed one final night to let go of the version of Adrian I kept trying to save in my head. Around 6:30 there was a quiet knock at the door. I stared at it in disbelief because Adrian had never knocked before. Come in, I whispered. The door opened slowly. Adrian stood there holding a white ceramic mug in one hand. Coffee steam curled upward between us. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. Like something inside him had finally started cracking beneath pressure. He did not know how to survive. You did not sleep, he said quietly. Neither of us mentioned the fact that he had not slept either. I looked at the mug in his hand cautiously. You made coffee? I tried. The smallest almost smile touched my mouth before disappearing again. Adrian stepped inside carefully, like he was entering unfamiliar territory. Maybe he was. He placed the mug beside me near the window. 2 sugars. Cinnamon. My chest tightened painfully. Not because he remembered. Because of how shocked I felt that he did. You remembered. I whispered before I could stop myself. Adrian looked away briefly. I remember more than you think. The problem was that remembering details was not the same as making someone feel loved. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug slowly while he stood near the doorway watching me with an expression I could not fully read anymore. There was no arrogance left in him now. Only confusion. Regret. Fear maybe. Evelyn, he said quietly. After a long silence, why did you never tell me it was this bad? I stared down into the coffee for several seconds before answering because the truth sounded pathetic when spoken out loud. I did. His face tightened instantly. No, you did not. I looked up at him then. 3 years ago I asked you not to take calls during dinner anymore. Silence. 2 years ago I told you I felt lonely in this apartment. His eyes darkened slightly. Last Christmas I cried in front of you because you canceled our trip for another meeting in Sicily. Adrian's breathing slowed almost painfully. I continued anyway. You always listened for a minute. My voice softened. Then you kissed my forehead, solved whatever crisis mattered to you, and assumed I would survive it quietly. The room felt unbearably still. Adrian leaned one hand against the doorway like the weight of the conversation was finally becoming physical. I thought you understood my responsibilities. I did. Tears blurred my vision again despite my effort to stay composed. That is why I kept forgiving you. His expression shifted then. Sharp. Wounded. Because forgiveness sounded beautiful until you realized how much damage had to happen first. I looked around the guest room slowly. The untouched shelves. The empty walls. The life waiting outside this penthouse that terrified me and excited me at the same time. Do you know when I stopped fighting for us? I asked softly. Adrian stayed completely still. The night I realized I could disappear emotionally, and you would still call our marriage stable. That sentence finally broke something in him. I saw it clearly this time. Not in anger. Not in pride. But in the awful silence of a man realizing too late that the woman he loved had been drowning quietly beside him for years while he called it peace. By noon the rain had stopped completely. Sunlight spilled across the penthouse windows in pale gold streaks, but the apartment still felt cold somehow. Adrian had spent most of the morning on calls inside his office while I quietly packed the final pieces of my life into 2 suitcases. 6 years reduced to folded sweaters, books with bent corners, old photographs, and grief too heavy to fit anywhere. I moved slowly through the bedroom because every object carried memory. The silver frame beside the bed from our honeymoon in Italy. The black silk robe Adrian bought me during our 2nd anniversary. The piano sheet music he once listened to me play before business dinner started replacing evenings together. Strange how relationships died quietly. Not with screaming. Not with betrayal. Just tiny abandonments repeated often enough that love slowly lost oxygen. I was kneeling beside the closet organizing papers into a small leather folder when I heard Adrian's office door open downstairs. A few seconds later his footsteps crossed the living room quickly. Faster than usual. Purposeful. Uneasy. Then he appeared in the bedroom doorway with something in his hand. A thin white envelope. His expression looked wrong immediately. Not cold. Not controlled. Shaken. Truly shaken. "What is this?" he asked quietly. I looked down at the envelope and felt my stomach tighten instantly. I recognized my handwriting before he even held it up properly. The letter. Dear God. I had forgotten it was still there. Adrian must have found it while searching through documents in the office downstairs. The room suddenly felt too warm to breathe in. "Evelyn," he said again, voice rougher now. "What is this?" I stood slowly, heart pounding so hard it hurt. "You were not supposed to read that." His eyes lifted to mine then, dark with something I had never seen directed at me before. Fear. Genuine fear. "You wrote this after the miscarriage?" I closed my eyes briefly because hearing the words spoken aloud made the memory crawl back into my chest all over again. The panic attacks. The sleepless nights. The unbearable silence after losing someone who had barely existed long enough to be real. Adrian stepped farther into the room holding the paper carefully like it might break apart in his hands. "You wrote that you did not want to wake up anymore." Tears burned instantly behind my eyes. I was grieving. "You were alone." The way he said it shattered something inside me. Not defensive. Not angry. Horrified. I looked away because I could not survive seeing pity in Adrian DeLuca's eyes. "I did not know who to call," I whispered. "You were in Zurich." Silence crashed into the room. Adrian looked back down at the letter again. I remembered writing it 3 months after the miscarriage during one of the worst nights of my life. I had sat alone in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, while the city lights blurred through tears I could not stop. The letter was never meant to be found. It was not even really a letter. Just pages of exhaustion from a woman slowly disappearing inside loneliness. Adrian's breathing became uneven beside me. Tiny shifts. Tiny cracks. But devastating coming from a man who built his entire identity around control. "You smiled through all of this," he said quietly, almost to himself. "At dinners. At events. With me." I laughed softly through tears because that was the cruelest part of being emotionally abandoned. "You became good at pretending survival looked graceful." "What else was I supposed to do?" I whispered. Adrian looked at me then like he no longer recognized the woman standing in front of him. Maybe because for the first time he was finally seeing me clearly instead of seeing the quiet version of me that made his life easier. He lowered the letter slowly. "I thought you were strong," he said. My chest ached so badly I could barely breathe around it. I whispered. "But strong people break too when nobody notices they are carrying everything alone." Adrian stared at me in complete silence after that. And for the first time since I met him, the most powerful man in New York looked completely helpless. I left the penthouse at 4:20 in the afternoon while the city drowned in pale winter sunlight. Adrian stood near the living room windows as I rolled my suitcase toward the elevator, his white dress shirt wrinkled for the first time I could remember, the letter still folded tightly in one hand. He had not taken another business call in hours. His phone kept vibrating against the marble counter downstairs like a heartbeat he was trying to ignore. I stopped near the elevator doors and looked back at him one final time. 6 years. 6 years of loving a man who never realized silence could become a form of loneliness all by itself. Adrian lifted his eyes toward me slowly. There was no anger left in them now. No cold authority. Just exhaustion and something dangerously close to grief. "Where will you go?" he asked quietly. I hesitated before answering because part of me still hated causing him pain even after everything. Maine. His brow furrowed slightly. Maine. There is a small bookstore near Bar Harbor looking for temporary help. A bookstore. Saying the words out loud felt strange after years of burying every small dream beneath Adrian's enormous world. He stared at me for several long seconds. You would leave this life to work in a bookstore? I almost smiled then because he still did not fully understand. It had never been about luxury. Not really. I would leave this life to feel alive again. Silence settled between us one last time. Then Adrian crossed the room slowly until only a few feet separated us. I could see the exhaustion in his face clearly now. The sleepless night. The guilt finally settling into his bones. He looked older somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. Evelyn, he said softly, I did love you. Tears burned behind my eyes immediately because I believed him. That was the tragedy of it all. Adrian had loved me in the only way he knew how. Possessively. Protectively. Materially. But never gently enough to notice when I started disappearing beside him. I know, I whispered. That is what makes this so sad. His throat moved slightly like he wanted to say something else but could not find words sharp enough to cut through years of damage. The elevator chimed softly behind me. I tightened my fingers around the suitcase handle before stepping backward. Adrian's eyes dropped briefly to my left hand. Bare now. No wedding ring. I watched that realization hit him all over again. If I asked you to stay, he said quietly, would you? I closed my eyes for one painful second because a part of me still wanted him to say the exact right thing. To finally break open emotionally. To fight for me the way I had fought for us for years. But love built on almost eventually becomes exhausting. No, I whispered honestly. The answer shattered something inside him. I saw it happen in real time. Tiny fracture. Tiny loss of composure. Adrian looked away first this time, jaw tightening hard as he nodded once. I do not know how to fix this, he admitted quietly. Hearing Adrian DeLuca confess helplessness felt more heartbreaking than anger ever could have. I stepped into the elevator slowly. The doors began closing between us while Manhattan sunlight spilled across the penthouse floors behind him. For one terrible second, he looked less like the most feared man in New York, and more like a husband realizing too late that he had spent years protecting a marriage he never properly cared for. Just before the elevator doors shut completely, Adrian spoke again, barely above a whisper. You were the only peaceful thing in my life. My chest ached so hard I thought it might split open. But the doors closed anyway. And as the elevator carried me farther away from the man I once would have destroyed myself to keep, I realized something devastating. Sometimes love does not die because two people stop loving each other. Sometimes it dies because one person keeps asking to be seen until eventually they become too tired to ask anymore. 3 months later, the ocean outside my apartment window sounded nothing like Manhattan. No sirens. No helicopters. No endless traffic echoing through steel towers at 3 in the morning. Just waves folding gently against the rocky Maine shoreline beneath pale autumn skies. I had learned the sound of peace slowly. At first, silence terrified me because I spent years associating quiet with emotional abandonment. But here silence felt different. Warm. Honest. Healing. The bookstore smelled like coffee beans, old paper and cedar shelves polished by hand every Sunday morning. Small-town tourists wandered through the aisles while rain tapped softly against the front windows, and for the first time in years, my chest no longer felt tight every time my phone buzzed. I was standing on a ladder organizing hardcovers in the fiction section when the bell above the bookstore door rang softly. We close in 20 minutes, I called automatically without looking down. No answer came. Something in the silence made my stomach tighten unexpectedly. I turned slowly. Adrian stood near the entrance wearing a charcoal coat darkened slightly by rain. His hands empty for once. No phone. No security. No expensive watch gleaming beneath the lights. He looked thinner than I remembered. Exhaustion carved faint shadows beneath his eyes, and for the first time since I met him, Adrian DeLuca looked like a man who had not slept properly in months. My heartbeat stumbled painfully against my ribs. Neither of us moved at first. The bookstore suddenly felt very small around all the unfinished things between us. Adrian's eyes traveled slowly across the shelves behind me before returning to my face. You cut your hair, he said quietly. I touched the shorter waves near my shoulders instinctively. People change. A sad almost smile crossed his face at that. I know. I climbed down from the ladder carefully while trying to steady my breathing. Seeing Adrian here felt unreal somehow, like spotting a storm cloud inside a peaceful painting. How did you find me? I asked softly. Your friend Amelia posted a picture online. Of course she did. I made a mental note to kill her gently later. Adrian took a slow step farther into the bookstore, eyes moving around the space carefully. The worn couches near the fireplace. The handwritten staff recommendations hanging beneath shelves. The tiny cafe corner where I spent mornings learning how to make cinnamon lattes badly. You look happy, he said quietly. The words sounded painful coming from him. I swallowed hard because the truth was complicated. I look rested. Adrian nodded once like he understood the difference immediately. Rain tapped softly against the windows while silence stretched between us again. But this silence no longer felt cruel. It felt fragile. Honest. I sold the penthouse, he said suddenly. My eyes widened slightly. Adrian looked down briefly before continuing. I stopped taking meetings after midnight. I fired 3 executives. I have dinner at home now. A soft bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. You learned how to become a person after I left? His expression tightened with regret. Instead of anger. I learned what loneliness actually feels like. That answer hit somewhere deep inside me because for the first time Adrian sounded less like a powerful man trying to win back his wife, and more like someone finally stripped down to truth. He stepped closer slowly until only a few feet separated us. I spent years thinking love meant protecting you from the world, he said quietly. I did not realize I was protecting myself from vulnerability too. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. Adrian noticed immediately but did not reach for me this time. That alone told me how much he had changed. I am not asking you to forgive me today, he continued softly. I just needed you to know that losing you forced me to become someone capable of loving you correctly. The bookstore lights glowed softly around us while evening rain blurred the harbor outside. I looked at the man standing in front of me and realized something heartbreaking. Adrian DeLuca had finally learned how to speak the language I spent 6 years begging him to understand. The tragedy was that growth often arrives after damage already exists. My eyes dropped briefly to his hands resting at his sides. Empty. Open. Human. Slowly, carefully, I stepped closer until I could hear his breathing again. Adrian looked down at me with quiet uncertainty replacing all the certainty he once carried like armor. I do not know what happens now, I whispered honestly. His eyes softened in a way I had once prayed to see years ago. Neither do I. Then for the first time since I left New York, Adrian smiled without power behind it. Just tenderness. Just hope. And somehow that frightened me far more than the version of him who once ruled entire rooms without raising his voice.